This is A Different Perspective with Kevin Randle. A retired U.S. Lieutenant Colonel, Kevin Randle has been studying UFOs for nearly 50 years. Kevin has investigated some of the most famous UFO cases in the world and has been consulted for dozens of documentaries about UFOs. Considered one of the leading experts into the Roswell UFO crash of 1947, Kevin has written more than 25 books about UFOs, including the recently published Roswell in the 21st Century. Now, here is the host of A Different Perspective, Kevin Randle.
And welcome to this edition of A Different Perspective. I am, in fact, Kevin Randle, believe it or not. I'm flying solo today because of some complications with witnesses or guests that I wanted on the program, which I'll explain a little bit later. This all has started a couple of weeks ago, 10 days ago, when Christopher Mellon, who had a high position in the government at one time, released a document, a brief document of email exchanges that relates to this whole thing. I have the document here and we'll go into it quickly. It says, and he starts off with, redacted and I are making huge progress getting into the crash retrieval program. He plans to meet with you at some point. Next part of the chain, the redacted would be slack-jawed if they found out what we now know. And there's a deleted comment there. And then we go to, right now, we haven't gone that far back. We're dealing with the recovered UAP that landed in Kingman, Arizona in the 1950s. We're vacuuming up info as redacted, read in. We now know the management structure and security control systems and ownership of the crash retrieval. We also know who recovers landed, crashed UAPs under what authorities. We also know that a still highly classified memo by the Secretary of the Air Force in the 1950s is still in effect to maintain the cover on UAPs. And the final response is, we also know the SES-2, who's the Air Force gatekeeper, and then it's redacted. So he's talking about the Kingman UFO crash from May 21st of 1953. Now, we learned about this event in 1973, when a fellow who was identified as Fritz Weaver talked to UFO investigators about his experiences in this crash. The story came out in Official UFO magazine in 1973, written by Ray Fowler, who's a respected UFO investigator. And the article was, "What about crashed UFOs?" Now, he talks a little bit about some of these, I guess, the stories from earlier, but he focuses on one from 1953. And he says the witness is a fellow named Fritz Weaver. In the story, that's the name that they used it throughout. We know that's a pseudonym. Fritz Weaver is actually Arthur Stanzel. And what the story is, Stanzel was working at, and I believe it's Indian Springs Air Force Base at the time, and they're dropping atomic bombs all over southern Nevada, testing the fallout, testing the effects of the blast and all that sort of thing. He claimed at one point, he and a number of his colleagues, after one of these tests, saw a UFO traveling in the area of the explosion. Later on, he said, no, he didn't see that. He was merely he had overheard them talking about it. But he talks about how he had been called by his boss and told that they wanted him for a special assignment. And the next day, which would be May 21st, 1953, he and a number of his colleagues were flown to Phoenix, Arizona at about 4:30 in the afternoon. They were put on a bus and they drove for 4 hours to what he believed was Kingman, Arizona. This really kind of makes no sense to me because A, it would have put him there after dark, but more importantly, it would have been quicker to go from Indian Spring Air Force Base to Kingman, Arizona than go to Phoenix and kind of backtrack toward Kingman. He said that when they got there, they got off the bus, they were given their assignments. He saw a craft that was 30 feet in diameter, maybe 14 feet tall, impacted into the desert at a slight angle. His job was to figure out the trajectory and the speed in which the object, the UFO, crashed, and how far it was indented into the ground. He said during his time there, he happened to catch a glimpse inside the craft and didn't see a whole lot. He also glimpsed inside a tent where he saw one alien body. The description was about 4 feet tall. The skin was brown. It was wearing some kind of a flight suit. Once he completed his calculations, he got back on the bus. Interestingly, he talks about how they were not allowed to talk to one another while on the bus or in doing their jobs at the Kingman area. And yet the colonel, always a colonel, was checking off their names as they got back in the bus, and he was reading off the names. So anybody on the bus would hear the names of the other people involved, which was a terrible breach of security. He also suggested they were told to only pay attention to their area of expertise, Stansel's being the trajectory and the speed of the craft. But he did talk about having a chance to look inside the craft. I glanced as he walked by an open hatch or an open doorway. And what kind of caught my attention, he talked about what he saw was some panels with switches and buttons on it. And I'm thinking in today's environment, we would have touchscreens. So the technology wasn't very advanced for an alien spacecraft, but it fit into the technology that we were dealing with at the time. We were talking about touchscreens and that sort of thing. And then he went back to his regular job. And he didn't talk about this for nearly 20 years. Somehow, two teenagers, I called them boys, two teenagers who were interested in UFOs, found out about his UFO sighting, I suppose, and went to interview him at his home in February of 1973. They talked about this event, the crash, and all of this sort of thing, Stansel giving them all the information. This alerted Ray Fowler, who is a respected UFO investigator who's done a lot of interesting work in the field of UFOs, to interview Stansel as well. And he produced a long report for NICAP. And that NICAP figures in this, I think, a little bit more prominently than most people would like to believe. What Stansel learned substantially corroborated what the boys were told by Stansel about the craft and how it all it came about that he was involved in the retrieval operation. The problem is we've all heard that story. We've read that story. I've written about that story twice, once in a book called A History of UFO Crashes, and then later, 15 years later, a book called Crash When UFOs Fall from the Sky. I gave it a less than critical review, meaning that I wasn't really sure about where this thing was going. The problem with the case, of course, is like so many others, it was single witness. It was Arthur Stansel's word. A man with an impressive resume, which we've all looked at and we knew about. And I think Ray Fowler checked it out to make sure that there were no paddings on the resume. So he found Stansel to be a credible witness. But he did a lot of investigation and produced a long report that went to NICAP. The thing that never comes out, and I'm not sure how I missed this because I've had it all along. I've got a copy of Fowler's investigation. I think that a copy is in the museum in Kingman, Arizona, but I don't know how in-depth that copy is. And there's a question that I put out to a reporter from a Phoenix television station who had just been to there, and he was seen in the or recorded in the museum, flipping through the pages of the report. And I could recognize the pages because I've got the same thing here. I wanted to know if he'd read the file carefully, because there's documentation toward the end of it that is very, very worrisome, and we'll get into that. At one point, Don Schmidt told me he had found a witness named Judy Wilcott, who claimed that her husband had been involved in the Kingman crash. He had been deployed to Vietnam, and just weeks before he was killed in Vietnam, he sent her a letter and explained this to her. Hadn't explained it to her from 1953 until the time he got to Vietnam. But he had written down the details of what he had seen. Now, this becomes interesting corroboration. We got a second witness, indirectly, Judy Wilcott talking about that. If she could produce the letter, now we have a document that predated what has been published in the various media that would help corroborate the story. On the night, I was doing a radio interview on the book Crash When UFOs Fell from the Sky. Before the timing of that interview, I got a phone call from Judy Wilcock's daughter. And she said what her mother told him was telling us was all a pack of lies. Her mother lied all the time. She said that her father was not killed in Vietnam. He came home, they got divorced. He hadn't written any such letter. So that corroboration kind of evaporated. And yet in today's environment, I see Judy Wilcox still mentioned as a source of credible information, even though that information about Judy Wilcox appears on my blog and has been there since 2010. So we're back to a single witness on the story. But others have come forward, others have been found. Now, before I got to this point, meaning the program today, I had sent emails to a guy named Harry Drew and another guy named Preston Dennett, who claimed expertise in the Kingman crash. They had been researching it for a number of years, found a number of additional witnesses and that sort of thing. There was no response from either one of those. I had hoped to be able to talk to him about some of the things I did. I unfortunately had to buy Dennett's book about UFOs over Arizona, I believe is the case, because he talks about the Kingman crash in that book. So what I saw from his book, he misspells Stodzel's name throughout it. He misspells Judy Wilcox's name throughout it. He seems unaware that her story has been discredited and talks about 3 either landings or crashes in the Kingman area in the space of a few weeks, which makes me wonder about the credibility of his sources. But I would have loved to chat with him on this program so we could get a better idea of what he thinks he knows or what he has found out or what he has seen. The stumbling block for me in this investigation at this point was what was held in the museum there in Kingman. I didn't know how much they had because they talked about redacted documents. They talked about having a display there. They talked about this sort of thing. I think I know what's going on there. That most of the documentation is newspaper articles. The redacted file may be part of Ray Fowler's work. And that sort of thing, and maybe copies of the magazine article that dealt with this crash as well. So we've got a lot of information out there, a lot of documentation, a lot of alleged witnesses. What can we make of all this? Is the Kingman crash any good, or is it still basically a single witness that goes back to Arthur Stodzel's interview with the teenage boys and then later with Ray Fowler talking about this corroboration? I will say before we break here that Stodzel does have an impressive resume. He did have an impressive resume. He worked in a lot of important jobs in the military or with the military. He apparently was an infantryman during the Second World War, which, I mean, kind of raises his credibility somewhat. But there are other issues that have not been addressed, and I think that's what we're going to go through here in a little while. Anyway, my book, Crash When UFOs Fall from the Sky, has a long segment on Kingman. My blog also has a latest update on this stuff, and you can link to other things as well. I'll be back right after this.
Are you ready for a tale that will leave you on the edge of your seat? Get ready to dive into the gripping memoir by Bart Sibrel titled Moon Man. Bart Sibrel takes you on a heart-pounding journey, unmasking the truth behind America's famous Apollo missions. Prepare yourself for hair-raising encounters with agents from the U.S. government's top-secret agencies. In Moon Man, Sibrel fearlessly reveals his real-life espionage adventures, shining a light on one of the CIA's best-kept secrets. Brace yourself for shocking revelations, including Sibrel's discovery of privately recorded audio exposing an Apollo astronaut's chilling plot, a plot orchestrated by the CIA. That's right. As Sibrel unveils this groundbreaking evidence, it becomes clear that there is much more to the Apollo missions than meets the eye. Could it be that we've been deceived all along? Moon Man is a gripping page-turner that challenges everything you thought you knew. It's a mind-bending journey into the unknown, where the line between truth and fiction becomes blurred. Don't miss this opportunity to uncover the secrets hidden for decades. Let your curiosity guide you as you join Bart Sibrel on his quest to find the truth. Moon Man, available now at Sibrel.com. That's Sibrel.com. Prepare to have your beliefs shaken to the very core.
And I have returned. Well, when we went away, I was kind of talking about some of the documentation available. I think most of it is Ray Fowler's work and newspaper articles. I don't think there's anything from the government. The Air Force didn't investigate the Kingman crash, according to Project Blue Book, and I think that's probably because they didn't know about it. This information didn't leak into the public arena, and I'm not sure leak is the right word, until 1973, as I've said before. And before we go much further, I want to thank David Rudiak, Rob Swiatek, Ryan Wood for their assistance in helping assemble some of this information. And that assembly continues as we're looking for more information. Dave Rudiak has just scoured several newspapers from the era, trying to find any references to the Kingman crash, and came up with some bizarre information about a National Guard being out there and the fighting a fire, and came across some of this, and guys being badly burned or actually killed in the fire, and the sheriff following an ambulance into Kingman, and the ambulance disappears, and all kinds of weirdness that may or may not be related to the Kingman crash. I don't think it is, because I think that stuff, if I remember correctly from what Rudiak had sent me, was from 1950 as opposed to 1953. So anyway, we have a story now with a single witness named Arthur Stansel. We're looking at the credibility story. There are an awful lot of crash retrieval stories. I should point that out. In Crash When UFOs Fall from the Sky, I think I have 118 of them. Ryan Wood just updated his book on UFO crashes, MJ12 type thing. And he has quite a few in there. I noticed in the book, and he didn't answer my question, I sent him an email about it, but I noticed in the first edition of, I think it's about MJ12, it's Magic something, I think, but it deals with UFO crashes. He gave the Kingman a higher credibility rating than he gave it in the newest edition, and I found that interesting, and I wondered why he had devalued that information. I think it's probably a hoax, but that's just kind of my opinion. Maybe shooting myself in the foot by suggesting it's a hoax at this point in the discussion. Anyway, Stansel was interviewed by Ray Fowler. And later on, Stansel said that when he was drinking, he tended to make up stories. That was his thing, I guess. And Ray asked Jeff Young and Paul Cheatham, the teenagers who interviewed him first, about that claim, and they said no, he wasn't drinking when they were interviewing him. But Stansel insisted he had four martinis during the discussion, and that was maybe the inspiration for some of his story. And like I said, he also claimed a UFO sighting that he backtracked on. So what has bothered me about this case now and today, like I said, I have had a copy of Fowler's complete file for literally decades. I have read quite a bit about this case in a variety of sources. It's mentioned briefly, for example, in Timothy Good's book, Above Top Secret. It's mentioned briefly in Richard Dolan's book about the national security state, or whatever his two original history books were entitled. All suggesting that there's something to the story. There's one other thing that is a bit worrisome. One of the people has suggested this crash was really at Paradise Valley, Arizona, and that came from, I think, 1948, when the man who wrote Behind the Flying Saucers, whose name escapes me at the moment, can't help that, wrote about 3 UFO crashes in the desert Southwest. One of them would be in Paradise Valley, but if it's 1948, then it couldn't really reflect a Kingman. Frank Scully was the guy who wrote Behind the Flying Saucers. But it really doesn't corroborate this sort of thing because it's too early. So we got some problems. We got to figure that out. I think that Paradise Valley really doesn't figure in this. I think that's a mistake that some of the later reporters on the case have misconstrued is the best way of putting it. I don't think it was intentional. I think they just misconstrued it. Anyway, I've got, as I said, I've got the whole of Fowler's report. Now, when I wrote my books, I read the descriptions that Stancil had give about the craft and how he got there and that sort of thing. And I mentioned the Judy Wolcott story and that sort of thing. I also mentioned that Len Stringfield in one of his, actually in a couple of his status reports on UFO crashes, mentions a Kingman story and says he's got 2 additional witnesses to this, but we don't know who they are. One of them he gives us the initials, and the other one he really doesn't identify. So we don't know who they are. We can't get in touch with them to see what they now know. I will say that I am positive that Len Stringfield would report accurately what they told him, which is not necessarily the truth, but Len was not making anything up. Len was very careful on that sort of thing. So we have that sort of thing going on. I finally looked at the entire file as this latest explosion of information on Kingman came about. And there's a section about contact with UFOs. So Stancil is now telling Young and Cheatham in the second part of their interview about how he has been in contact with alien creatures, that he has been using astral projection to project himself to alien worlds, and in one case onto an alien spacecraft where he was able to interact with the beings on board this craft. And he learned that that was some kind of a prison ship, and they had been away from a world. They've been in that ship for 1,000 years, according to what Stancil said, and that they were a little bit annoyed, and they thought that in their journeys around the galaxy, they had learned things that would be important for their home world to know. Stancil said he was unable to get to their home world because it may have been too far. I don't know if there was a limit on the astral projection or not. What this tells me is that he is involved with poor science fiction. Astral projection, interaction with alien beings, many, many alien beings. In fact, at one point, he said that the reason they have not contacted us, the alien beings, the off-world creatures, is because they're uninterested in Earth. They don't care about Earth. There's nothing here that they really want, and there's no reason for them to interact with us. So they just avoid us. They're not interested in the planet at all, which explains why they haven't landed, but it doesn't explain why they keep showing up. Anyway, this struck me as really, really odd. Now, Ray, in his investigation, he did try to verify an awful lot of information. He verified that Stancil was at Indian Spring Air Force Base at the time he said he was, that he did, in fact, work at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base for a time, that he was involved in engineering projects. He was a highly educated man with master's degree in engineering, for example. I think it was physics and engineering, or physics and engineering, or physics and mathematics that he had a master's degree in. So, I mean, he was an educated man, and yet he's spinning this tall tale. How does that relate to Kingman? Well, if he's talking about all this other activity on alien planets and alien beings and alien spacecraft, doesn't that kind of hurt his credibility in the first part of the story, being involved in this crash retrieval? I do not know why none of this was published before. I didn't publish. If I had read the entire file carefully, I would have published that stuff in Crash When UFOs Fall from the Sky. It was only recently, and I say this information now is at my blog at kevinrandle.blogspot.com for you all to take a look at, and you can see some quotes from the later interview where he talks about this. And yet Ray Fowler said that he found Stancil to be credible. I find that very, very worrisome, especially when we don't really have any good corroborative evidence of this crash. So we look at all that information and some of the things that are being developed and some of the things that are being said, 3 crashes in the area, all close together, all retrieved by the government. One may have been a landing as opposed to a crash. It may have been involved with some kind of super radar that knocked these things down. And I'm thinking, if we had a radar that was capable of bringing down alien spacecraft, wouldn't we have developed that into a weapon by now, some kind of a beamed weapon that we could knock the enemy's airplanes out of the sky, which we haven't done. And you have to remember, this is 1953 that we supposedly got our hands on this technology, or we had developed the radar technology, so we should have been able to expand it into something else, but there's no evidence that ever happened. So it calls the credibility of the story, it calls the credibility of the story into question once again. So we don't have a lot of interesting information about this. We have that little bit from Stoncel. We have what Judy Wilcox said. The other witnesses that Harry Dean and Paul Dennett had come up with into question as well, because we don't have a capability of interviewing them. Although, as I said, I've reached out to both of them and they have not bothered to respond to my queries on this. I thought that would be interesting to discuss this on the show. So we have Kingman now kind of isolated. I'm worried about the number of crashes. I'm worried overall in the totality. And I think that if we are dealing with any UFO crashes, you're going to be able to basically count those legitimate crashes on one finger. I think the others are misidentifications, and some of them are very interesting. And I'm thinking of Kecksburg, for example, are very interesting, but I don't think it's a UFO crash. Anyway, in this document that Mellon released, I said there was an interesting point to it. And this is what I found very interesting. He said that we also know who recovers landed or crashed UAPs under what authorities. That would be interesting for us to know. We also know that a still highly classified memo by Secretary of the Air Force in the 1950s is still in effect to maintain the cover on UAPs. There were 5 secretaries of the Air Force in the 1950s. All of them are dead. I looked it up. So there's nowhere to go with that. If it's a highly classified memo, it's going to be very closely held, and national security is going to rear its ugly head. We won't be able to get it. We will be denied any access to it. But this is, I think, given the source, Christopher Mellon, may be an attempt to validate some of the MJ-12 material, you know, the highly classified program and who has the authority and that sort of thing. Because in the early MJ-12 documents, you had that kind of authority expressed. Truman gave the authority to the MJ-12 committee. That would be who would do it. All the alleged members of the MJ-12 committee in the late 1940s are dead, and there is really no evidence that they were involved in anything like this at any time during their careers. But there's no way to verify. We have not verified any of that information, I guess is the best way to say that. When we come back, we're going to look at some more of this information and see where it takes us, and especially where we can go today. And as I said, we have a number of people working on this, seeing what they can learn based on the files available through the internet and the things that we have gathered. I will be back right after this with more.
Welcome to Haunted Indian River County by Larry Lawson. Indian River County is an idyllic vacation spot on Florida's east coast, not far south of Cape Canaveral. Known as part of the state's famed Treasure Coast, many are unaware of the deep and fascinating history this area played in the development of the Sunshine State. Also lost among its visitors and residents are the chilling stories of the hauntings that accompany this rich history. It is here that a man named Waldo still looks after his family and properties 6 decades after his death. Or a retired preacher is seen digging up his hidden treasure days after he died. Larry Lawson spent more than 40 years in the law enforcement and criminal justice education profession. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree from Nova Southeastern University and a master's degree in public administration from Troy State University. He serves on the board of directors of the Indian River County Historical Society, is the director of the Florida Bureau of Paranormal Investigation, and is the owner of Indian River Hauntings, LLC, where he provides historical and paranormal tours and events. He has been actively researching the history and paranormal legends of the Treasure Coast of Florida since 2010. Larry is currently the host of Paranormal Stakeout radio TV show on the Exozone Broadcast Network and the past host of Encounters with the Other Side on WPSL Radio in Fort Pierce, Florida. Pre-order your copy of Haunted Indian River County by Larry Lawson on Amazon.com today.
And I am back with more information about the UFO crash outside of Kingman, Arizona. I'm not the only one that's investigated this, of course. Ryan Wood has done some work on it, and in his books provide the same sort of information that I have here. Bill Moore, who was sort of the guru of crash retrievals in the early 1980s with his research into the Roswell case before he managed to self-destruct in 1989, presented a paper at the MUFON Symposium in 1982, and he did address the Kingman crash. Now, according to Stonczel's calendar, his boss at Indian Springs was a guy named Dr. Dahl, and Moore tracked down Dahl, who said that he didn't really know Stonczel. He didn't know who he was. They didn't know what he was talking about. I don't know how accurate that information is because I didn't talk to Dr. Dahl, and there seemed to be a bias by Moore against any other related UFO crashes that would detract from the Roswell case. So I'm not sure how accurate the information is. I throw that out there as one of the other problems we have with the Kingman crash. Anyway, his investigation was looking at some of that information, talked about the Aztec crash from 1948, which was featured in Behind the Flying Saucers by Scully. That, again, I think is pretty much a hoax. Most people accept it as being a hoax. There's still some discussion about it. But Moore is not impressed with the story either. So we have, at this point, we have now new people coming in, starting in the 1990s, Harry Dean and Preston Dennett coming and talking about it. I'm bothered by the accuracy of their information. I have not talked to Dean, so I'm not sure, but what I've been able to recover from Dennett, the information has what I think of as kind of trivial mistakes, things that shouldn't be made. Misspelling Stonczel's name at this point, I don't know. I don't understand that at all. You can find the correct spelling a number of places. And he knows that Stonczel had died, I think, in 2005, 2006. I've on my blog actually have a picture of his grave marker. So that kind of worries me about all of this sort of thing. So we're looking at Kingman in that respect. At this point, the only new information we have is the Mellon email that provides us with absolutely nothing other than the fact it mentions Kingman, Arizona. Going off on a tangent, when I had produced a possible list of the crash retrievals that David Grush was talking about when he mentioned there were 12 crash retrievals starting with Italy in 1933, and he mentioned the Roswell case, but he didn't mention any of the others. I put together what I thought might be the other 10 crashes based on more or less the information available about those in the public arena and how widespread that information was. One of those I touched on was the Kingman crash. Now, my understanding is that Grush was at Skinwalker Ranch, and I think I mentioned that in the past. That's what my understanding is, and that would have put him into touch with some of these same people that Mellon would be in touch with, and he may have actually talked to Mellon and heard what Mellon had to say and knew what he had to say about the Kingman crash, which does not bode well for Grush's information at all. So we're still working that angle of it. And it kind of, like I said, it reflects on Grush's credibility. I don't think Grush was lying about anything he said. I think he was repeating what he had been told by others or might have overheard in discussions that others were having about this sort of thing. That memo doesn't really tell us much of anything. There's really nothing there. And we've gone down those rabbit holes more than one time chasing this sort of thing. Because we have a little bit of information and it sounds good in the beginning. And when we get to the end of the bottom of the hole, we find that there's really nothing to it. So kind of a review is we learn about this crash in 1973 when Fowler publishes his article. We don't hear a lot about it other than what Fowler had reported. There has been some discussion about it. We have others coming in to investigate it, and they're absolutely convinced at it. One of the things that was said, and David Rudiak pointed this out, was that the area around Kingman during World War II was a training base. I think it was a Army Air Force's training base. So there were things that you would have found out in the deserts around Kingman. One of the things they claimed they did find in their search for the UFO crash site was an old Army field kitchen. I don't know what an Army field kitchen would have been left out there for, but they found those remains and kind of related it to the investigation in 1953. It may have been out there much longer than that. We just don't know. So here's where we kind of stand on this sort of thing. We have the new memo. We have an awful lot of information that kind of blows up. Arthur Stanzel seems to be a storyteller. I'm impressed with his credentials. I'm impressed with his military service. I believe that I read somewhere that he had actually been a participant in the Normandy invasion in the Second World War, which is quite impressive in and of itself. His educational credentials, his authoring of scientific papers, his jobs are quite impressive. Very, very talented, very educated man. And yet we have this UFO story, which, of course, in the 1970s, when it came out, there was great skepticism in the UFO community, because at that point, we really weren't discussing crashed UFO stories. We had been sidetracked, turned off by the Aztec crash and the investigation around that and how that all came to fruition. So we were a little bit annoyed about that, and we didn't want to have much to do with it. UFO crashes. It turned around in 1978 with the appearance of Jesse Marcel and the investigations by Stan Friedman and Len Stringfield into what Jesse Marcel said, and the body of evidence we were able to establish based on talking to other people who were assigned at the base in 1947 at Roswell. We could talk to those people. We could see documentation from the government and newspaper articles. We don't have that from Kingman. We have Ray Fowler's report, as far as I know. There are other newspaper clippings and other reports, but none of it from 1953. We don't have anything from 1953, which would be the real benefit there. So we're stuck with this story. And as I say, we're continuing the investigation into the case. We're learning a great deal about it. I fear that where we're going to end up is the place where we've ended up in a number of cases, and that is it's basically single witness. The crash on the plains of San Augustine, for example, in 1947, we talk about all the witnesses who have come forward since then. But if you follow the chain of evidence, it all comes from Barney Barnett. We have a single source. Everything grows from what he has said. I fear that's where we are on this case. We have a single source, Arthur Stanzel, who kind of shoots his own credibility in the foot with the story of the astral projection. He was part of a group apparently who met on Sunday nights. Don't know why I say Wednesday. Sunday nights to discuss these paranormal activities. And so he lists the names of all those people. There's no indication in the file that that Ray I've lost the train here. Sorry, folks. There's no evidence that Ray Fowler followed that train of evidence to talk to those people to see, yes, we did have these meetings. We did participate in these paranormal researches. They were all available or all able to do some kind of contact with paranormal phenomena and that sort of thing. Stansel said that he was the best at the astral projection and he was doing these far things. There's no evidence that Ray followed up on that, and I think that would be an important point to do, because if that group existed, then that helps the credibility of Arthur Stansel. But if they didn't exist, it was part of the whole story, or these people didn't meet every Sunday night to study paranormal phenomenon, then that kind of undercuts the credibility. So I guess where we are is we are now looking to gather more information about this case. We are working to identify more of the witnesses, or if the witnesses are credible. I'm still attempting to get in touch with the investigators, the later investigators on this case, to see what they've learned and see if we can get more information out of them. David Rudiak is doing a Herculean job of checking newspapers and going through that and following some of these leads. Rob Zwiatek was able to assist in some of the stuff that would have been available to MUFON at the time. Ryan Wood, of course, lists the story as well. And we've all kind of come to the same conclusion. Well, maybe that's not quite fair. We've all looking in the same direction, that this may not be an accurate representation of what was really going on. That the real problem is Arthur Stansel and his proclivity for inventing interesting tales when he's been drinking. You know, if we can't find some more information, some more evidence, then I think that's kind of where we're going to be, that Arthur Stansel kind of created this thing. Kingman, of course, is embracing this idea, not the way Roswell has, and not to the success of Roswell, but they're kind of embracing this idea of a crash in Kingman. But the thing that bothers me most is Stansel's claims of contact. And as I say, I'll have more information up on my blog about this as we gather it and see where we go with this thing. The one thing I will say, David Rudiak found a long listing of UFO sightings in 1950 that related to the thing with the National Guard captain and the firefighting that is kind of intriguing, but probably has nothing really to do with the Kingman case. But it's kind of an intriguing case that he's following up on, and he seems to be very excited about this. With any luck at all, David will be on the program next week, and we will talk a little bit about this sort of thing. So once again, if you're interested in this, take a look at Ryan Wood's latest book on the Kingman crash, not on the crash, but on his report on magic and UFO crashes. Take a look at Crash When UFOs Fall from the Sky. Take a look at my blog. There are links to other blog entries I have made about the Kingman crash that gives you some of the information I've sort of imparted here tonight, or today, or this afternoon, whatever time it is. And that's kevinrandle.blogspot.com. And if you're interested in following up on UFO crash, take a look at UFO Roswell in the 21st Century, which details that case in depth. Look at Understanding Roswell, because it puts it in the context of the whole UFO crash phenomenon, I suppose. And if you get a chance, look for Len Stringfield's status reports. I think some of them are available online now, so you can take a look at what he has said and what he looks at in the crash retrieval business. As I say, that kind of wraps it up here for today. I will be back in 1 week. Thanks for tuning in.